Hi folks, welcome to my second video. I gotta tell you, I had a lot of fun making the first one. So I'm excited about making these. And I have enough data to go through to literally make hundreds of these. So we're gonna have a good time doing this. So let's get started, shall we? And I want to begin where I always like to start with these data, with what you might call the coup de grace of the data. And I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly since I'm not French. And if I didn't, you can have fun laughing at my Midwestern accent trying to pronounce French words. I'm German, not French. My last name is Grimm, and you don't get much more German than that. Ich bin Deutsch und ich spreche Deutsch. Yeah, maybe I'll teach you some German along the way, like I do to my kids at school. And if I do, here's the best part. I won't charge you any extra for it. I'll give it to you for free. Now, where was I before I so rudely interrupted myself? You know, I have a bad habit of doing that. Oh yeah, the coup de grace of the data, what's called the Dogma of Molecular Biology. I'll often tell people that I can disprove evolution and simultaneously prove the existence of God with only 13 letters and 5 arrows. Could it really be that easy? It sure is. And let me show you using the Dogma of Molecular Biology. If you've never heard of it, then take a look at this slide because here it is. This is how it's taught to everyone in any high school biology class, as well as any class that includes genetics or molecular biology. So if you've had any of these classes, you've been taught this. So let me go through this. In the Dogma of Molecular Biology, DNA is used to make RNA through the process of transcription, and RNA is used to make proteins through the process of translation. And DNA is used to make more DNA through the process of replication. All of these processes are required for life, and you cannot have any of these processes without DNA. In almost every class you take that involves the study of molecular biology, this is what you'll be taught. And on the one hand, that's fine, because it's true. It's all based on mountains of data that show this is how these life essential processes occur. But it doesn't end there. What's critical to understand is that this depiction of the Dogma of Molecular Biology is incomplete because the data show much more that needs to be included here. However, it is intentionally left incomplete for a strategic reason. It is intentionally left incomplete because if it's presented in its completed form, it literally becomes impossible to explain scientifically. So let me show you the complete and accurate version of the Dogma of Molecular Biology. Now notice on this slide, we now have our 13 letters. I'm not counting the title or the information at the bottom or the name of the processes. I'm counting DNA, RNA, and protein, okay? So we have our 13 letters and our 5 arrows. What we see now is that DNA is still used to make RNA through transcription, and RNA is still used to make proteins through translation, and DNA is still used to make more DNA through replication. But in addition to that, the proteins and the RNA are used to make the RNA and the proteins. And the proteins and the RNA are also used to make more DNA. So you need the proteins and the RNA to make the RNA and the proteins and to make more DNA. Furthermore, you need existing DNA for all of this. So you need the one to get the other two, but you also need the other two to get the one. You cannot have the DNA without the RNA and the proteins and existing DNA. But you cannot have the RNA and proteins without the DNA. You first need the RNA and proteins to exist before you can make the RNA and proteins. And you first need the DNA to exist before you can make the DNA that's made from DNA and RNA and proteins that you don't have yet. So you need all these pieces of the puzzle to exist before you can make them. You need A to make B and C, but you need B and C to make A to make B and C. By now, your head should be spinning. And if it is, that's a good thing, because that means you understand that what I just said makes no sense. It's just not possible. How can you have something before it's made? It's the greatest all-time catch-22. It's the classic chicken and the egg scenario. Which came first? And the only possible answer is none of the above. None of them individually came first before any of the rest of them. The only scientifically possible explanation is that they all had to come first, together at the same time. It's the only possible way all these life-essential functions can exist. The DNA, RNA, and proteins necessary for these processes to occur must have all shown up simultaneously in one moment. It is impossible, scientifically, for the required components of this biological system to have arisen gradually over time, because all the parts are required from day one, or the system will not operate. And if the system will not operate, life cannot exist, period. And let me give you some insight into the scope of this issue. In the Dogma of Molecular Biology, there are about 300 molecules required for these life-essential functions of DNA. There are about 100 unique proteins required for these processes, each of which first requires the 100 RNA molecules needed to make these proteins. And then there are up to 100 more RNA molecules needed that function as RNA molecules. That's about 300 unique molecules that are needed. You need the DNA to make all these roughly 300 molecules, but you also need these 300 molecules to make the DNA. And you need pre-existing DNA to make more DNA. You cannot have any of these 300 molecules without DNA, and you cannot have DNA or its functions without any of these 300 molecules. Therefore, each one of these 300 RNA and protein molecules and the DNA from which they originate must all be present at the same time from the beginning, or the system and functions of molecular biology cannot happen. And if that cannot happen, you cannot have life. Life depends on and it's based on these molecules and their functions. And by the way, this is all a concept called irreducible complexity, a term that was coined by Dr. Michael Behe, and I'll come back to this more than once in future videos. For life to have begun via any scientific theory, each of the 300 or more unique molecules required for the life-essential functions of DNA and the DNA would have had to all arise randomly, simultaneously, and independently of DNA, each other, and yet contain the same sequence for the RNA as the DNA from which it's encoded. But it doesn't stop at just the presence of all these molecules. These molecules must all interact with one another, so they must be able to function together. They must all have the appropriate and necessary subunits to be able to interact with one another, and therefore must know the function and subunits of the molecules it must interact with. So for life to arise via any scientific theory, each protein and RNA molecule would have had to randomly, independently, and simultaneously arise in a manner that would allow them to fit together, interact together, and function together. They must do this fully knowing the functions of each other, the functions of DNA, and with the exact sequences and subunits necessary to function together. So, how can all these molecules arise gradually, randomly, at various times, independently of one another, via evolution, and yet be needed at the same time, and still have the structures required to interact with one another, as well as to interact with DNA? Furthermore, how do all these molecules then end up being encoded by genes that are in DNA? If they come into existence gradually and independently over long periods of time. All this represents an insurmountable problem for science because it simply cannot happen scientifically. And if it's not possible, then evolution is not possible scientifically. It's that simple. And let me be clear. This is just what's needed for the system to operate. You then have to use the system to create every protein molecule required for every species that has ever lived. A number described by geneticist Michael Denton this way, and I quote, "The proteins for all the species of organisms that have ever lived, a number estimated to be approximately 1,000 million. Now, what's rather humorous here is that when you discuss this with the evolutionists, they'll respond by saying, nobody makes this argument anymore. It's antiquated. It's outdated. It's like they're saying, we've advanced way beyond this issue, so don't talk to me about this anymore. And again, they're doing this. That old familiar sleight of hand, right? They use and they say, look at all the shiny stuff. Deflecting and misdirecting. All with the intent of trying to avoid the real issue that they cannot explain in evolutionary terms. They don't want to talk about it because they know it's impossible to explain via evolution. It kills their theory before it even begins. So they try to avoid it, change the subject. Because if you cannot originate this system, nothing else matters. And any and all other evolutionary arguments don't even matter because you can't have life in the first place. And without being able to create life, you have nothing to evolve. You have nothing to evolve because it's not possible via evolution to get life started in the first place. It's impossible. It cannot happen via evolution. And folks, this isn't just me talking. It's the evolutionists themselves saying it, and it's all based on data. And I want you to read what the evolutionists themselves said about this very topic as far back as 1983. In a summary of the Fourth Congress of the International Society for the Study of the Origin of Life in 1983, Klaus Dost makes the following statement, and I quote, "For the first time, it has now been determined unequivocally by a large number of scientists that all evolutionary theses that living systems developed from polynucleotides which originated spontaneously are devoid of any empirical base." He's saying what I just told you. A large number of evolutionary scientists have jointly determined that there is no data, there is no scientific evidence to support that DNA and life itself could have arisen spontaneously. Those are the data, and they know it, and they admit it. What he's saying is that no data exists to support any scientific theory of how DNA and then life came into existence. There is no evidence, no experimental data, no observations, no practical reason, and no explanation to support the origin and existence of DNA, RNA, and proteins via any scientific theory. And we learn that and we know that from studying the structure, features, and functions of DNA. Let me also add that another way the evolutionists will try to divert this issue is with the discussion of things like retroviruses and retrotransposons. Retroviruses like HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, and retrotransposons, genetic areas that copy and paste themselves into other parts of the genome, can actually go from RNA to DNA using an enzyme called reverse transcriptase. So they'll argue about aspects like these, saying there are other ways that exist that don't directly follow the dogma of molecular biology. But it doesn't matter, because this process still requires the necessary proteins to go from RNA to DNA, and then from DNA to RNA, and then to proteins. They just have a different starting point. So all the DNA, RNA, and proteins necessary would still have had to come into existence simultaneously, just like I've already explained. Now, I started this video saying that I can disprove evolution and prove the existence of God with only 13 letters and 5 arrows. So, after explaining that it's not possible for the system of molecular biology to arise via evolution, what are you left with? Well, let me allow one of the foremost evolutionists of his day to explain it in his own words. The American scientist, evolutionist, and atheist Dr. George Wald said, and I quote, "When it comes to the origin of life, we have only two possibilities as to how life arose. One is spontaneous generation arising to evolution. The other is a supernatural creative act of God. There is no third possibility. Spontaneous generation was scientifically disproved 100 years ago by Louis Pasteur, Spallanzani, Reddy, and others. That leads us scientifically to only one possible conclusion, that life arose as a supernatural creative act of God." I will not accept that philosophically, because I do not want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe in that which I know is scientifically impossible: spontaneous generation arising to evolution. Do I really need to say any more? No matter what theories they teach to try to explain otherwise, the existence of DNA and its functions is not possible scientifically, and the scientists know it. And if evolution is impossible, the only other option you're left with, as Dr. Wald said, is that life started as a supernatural creative act of God. So that's how I can say that you can disprove evolution and prove the existence of God with only 13 letters and 5 arrows. And as this quote also explains, science has become a biased agenda. Much of it is no longer objective or based on data. And I'll have a lot more to say about that in future videos. I find it hilarious, actually, that Darwin's book entitled The Origin of Species says nothing about the actual origin of species or any other form of life. And the evolutionists never have anything to say about the origin of life because they don't have anything to say. It's just not possible scientifically. But this video isn't the end of this topic. It's only part 1. There's more to explain about the dogma of molecular biology and how it's a death sentence for evolution. because I need to explain how the evolutionists thought they had something to say about the origin of life. But in the interest of time, I'll leave that for part 2. So come on back for the next video where I'll expand on this topic. So thank you very much for watching. And as always, we'll leave the light on for you.